a proceduralist approach to value conflict in politics, as well as co-author of Is Whistleblowing a Duty? And Political Corruption, the Internal Enemy of Public Institutions. We look forward to her talk, and after that, I will collect your questions. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for being here, to the organizers for having me. Although in this virtual format, I'm really, really sorry for not being there with you. And I'd really like to thank Kirsten and Dimitris for really trying to make my in-person participation possible in many ways, but unfortunately, personal reasons really prevented me from flying all the way there. But I hope I will still be able to engage you with my recent work on institutional theory. And in particular, I will be sharing my PowerPoint shortly, but this paper is actually part of a much larger project on trust in the institutional concept. So the underlying question that motivates this part of my research is whether and to what extent we should conceptualize trust in relations between people who interact in an institutional capacity in different terms with respect to the concept of trust that we use to characterize interpersonal relations in other contexts, relationships between friends, members of family, members of sports clubs, or just bare individuals. So what is, if anything, special of the institutional context that requires a reconceptualization of the idea of trust as a feature of interpersonal relationships? So just to give you a sense of the kind of cases that sparked my interest in this topic, let me just give you a fictional, but not quite so unusual and unlikely scenario, where we are in a public hospital and we see Anne, who is a doctor who works in the public hospital. She knows that the hospital's regulations require the hospital manager, says Jenny, to purchase the drugs that provide the highest quality price ratio in the best interest of the patient's health. However, Anne has been reluctant to use Jenny's recently purchased drugs for her patients. In fact, Anne has begun to notice that all of them, surprisingly, are produced by the same pharmaceutical company, which happens to be the main organizer of the recent Congress Jenny has attended in exotic locations. For her part, Jenny, the manager, has noticed that Anne's reluctant to use the selected drugs. And of course, Jenny knows that hospital policy requires Anne to use these drugs, and that there are disciplinary actions that may be taken if Anne fails to do so. However, Jenny also knows that Anne has conducted some research on a new pharmaceutical technology that is an alternative to the one using the drug that Jenny has selected. As a result, the patient's treatment has recently slowed down. Nurses are never quite sure what kind of protocol they should be using, and they're starting to struggle to understand how to cater for patients' needs. So the diagnosis among the possible ways in which you may think that this scenario is problematic from an institutional point of view, the diagnosis I would like to propose to you is that this scenario instantiates a lack of mutual trust between the two office holders, Jenny and Anne, and that distrust is the lack of distrust is a problem because ultimately it undercuts the very operability of the institution. How will I make this case? Let me share my PowerPoint now. And by the way, if I return to the example mixing names. Please bear with me. I'm really terrible. My memory is very short term, even with the own fictional name I choose for myself. But anyway, so just remember that there's a manager and there's a doctor, and that we are in a public hospital. Now, the kind of relationship that is not in place in the scenario I have described to you is a trust relation of the kind that is generally presupposed and required in the context of public institutional action. And in particular, what I would like to propose is what is missing in that scenario is Anne and Jenny's mutual trust in each other's commitments in their institutional capacity. So for those who are, those of you who are into discussions of trust, what I will propose is a version of the commitment view of trust. So it's a cognitive understanding of trust, which, however, is particular, and I think particularly interesting in the context of institutional action. So how will I make this claim? So the key claims I will be making throughout this presentation are the following. There's a fundamental sense in which for an institution to be operational, it must be the case that the office holders who work in the institutions are committed to acting in ways that can be vindicated with reference to their power mandates. This is the idea of office accountability, about which I will be saying something shortly, which I have developed in previous work, especially in the context of my work on political corruption with Maria Paola Ferretti. This commitment of office holders is a second order commitment, which runs through all the possible roles that an individual may occupy within an institution. I don't know why I cannot use my arrows for the presentation, but I'll do this. So in the context of interrelated institutional roles, trusting that others, office holders, are committed to office accountability in this way, so always to be ready to justify the use of their power with reference to the terms of their mandate, gives the trusting office holder reason to act with the same commitment. And by abiding to the duty of office accountability, by showing trust in other office holders express their trustful relation, the trustful attitudes to others, and these empower the other office holders in the institution and set in motion institutional mechanisms that ultimately are capable of supporting public institutional action. This kind of cognitive trust, I will argue, has a special importance over other forms of dispositional or affective trust that the person who happened to occupy an institutional role may happen to entertain with each other. The role is special in sustaining the internal dynamics of public institutional action under conditions of institutional uncertainty. I should like to emphasize immediately that I would not consider the kind of a cognitive trust grounded in the knowledge that office holders are generally committed to office accountability. This kind of trust is not exhaustive of the possible ways in which trust is relevant in the institutional context. Of course, also interpersonal relations of trust, as I will try to show you later, can be important. Of course, if I am well disposed toward my colleagues, if I happen to be friends to my colleagues, that will facilitate institutional dynamics. So there's room also for personal trust that has also dispositional and affective grounds in the institutional context. But this is unspecific to the institutional context. These are the kind of trust that we may find in other contexts too, and that may be good or bad for institutional action in ways I will be discussing later. But I think that insofar as the institutional context is concerned, the specific type of commitment-based trust is distinctive and is worth investigating in its own terms. So these are the key claims I shall try to defend. Now, let me start by presenting my argument to you. So to begin with, as I said, that the kind of trust in which I'm interested in is a kind of trust that is special to the context of public institutional action. Let me tell you something about how I see the structure of public institutional action. I start from a very broad and I take fairly encompassing view of what institutions are. Institutions, in my view, are systems of interrelated roles, governed by rules and occupied by human persons. And these are the offices that constitute an institution. Now, offices are based on mandates. So office are roles inhabited by individuals that by the fact of entering an office acquire special normative powers in the form of rights and duties that are given to them by the mere fact of entering a role with a mandate. Mandates associated with different offices in an institution are established in view of an institution raison d'etre. Now, for the purpose of this special paper, I will, and the talk of today, I will have a fairly broad understanding of what institutions raison d'etre is. By institutions raison d'etre, I mean the set of normative ideas and values that motivate the establishment of an institution and regulate its functioning. So you may have a teleological view of an institution's raison d'etre, by which what motivates the establishment of an institution is the realization of a specific purpose. In the case of the hospital, that might be the protection of public health. In the case of the police, the protection of order and security. But you may also have a more deontological view of an institution's raison d'etre, by which the raison d'etre of the institution is the realization of some kind of higher order value, like justice or impartiality, things, for instance, of the raison d'etre of a democratic parliament. What matters to me to underline for the purposes of today's talk is that however you define an institution's raison d'etre, it is crucial to recognize that an institution's raison d'etre is a work in progress. It cannot be understood as something that is set in stone once and for all, and that works like a sort of benchmark, a standard for measuring the performance of institutional roles and how well an institution goes. The raison d'etre of any public institution is doomed to change over time and space. It evolves or involves sometimes. Just think about how the raison d'etre of public universities has changed throughout the centuries. And it has become more and more open to also not only being concerned with research and education, but also, for example, with civic engagement. Certain people who are critical of the kind of work we are currently doing in our universities tend to say that universities are transforming the raison d'etre from an academic enterprise to some kind of business-like sort of firm, a managerial enterprise. So as you see, the raison d'etre of the institution, and so the power mandates that characterize different roles are imbued with uncertainty. They are developing, evolving in ways that make institutional action proceed in extreme uncertain circumstances. When institutional role occupants act in their institutional capacity, they embody and actualize institutional action itself. It's a fundamental claim of my approach to public institutional action that public institutional action is irreducible to an aggregate of individual actions, but is not even something else from the actions of individual. Institutional action is constituted by the action of the office holders who act as members of the institution. office holders with specific normative powers given to them by occupying roles with a certain mandate are interrelated in such a way that the operability of institutional action depends on each and every office holder committed to specify through their action the work in progress of the institution raison d'etre. The exercise of the power of office that comes with each institutional role, in this sense, structurally depends on the exercise of the powers with which the other roles in the institutions are endowed. And all of them taken together, this interrelated structural role has the unique and fundamental responsibility of carrying out an institution raison d'etre. By carrying out, I mean always trying to understand it, specify, revise it, and possibly correct it. So you can immediately see that in my view, because institutional action consists in the office holder's action, there's a crucial role of the commitments that the office holders have and make when they're acting their institutional capacity towards institutional action itself. In this sense, acting in a public institutional capacity is nothing like following a script. It's more like acting on canvas. Power mandates in public institutions define the contour within which public office holders can exercise their mandate and their powers, but office holders ultimately retain very large margins of discretion when they decide how to use the power associated with their office. We've seen that in the case of the hospital from which we got started. Of course, the mandate of the hospital manager is to choose the drugs that will be used in the hospital. But the specific ways in which the choice is made, the balancing of the different costs and benefits when she makes these choices, ultimately allow for a very wide margin of discretion. Also, there may be some fundamental disagreement among office holders about what the set of normative values that motivate their action is. Therefore, to me, it is of pivotal importance to underscore that for the interrelated action of office holders to uphold the work in progress of the institution's raison d'etre, office holders ought to exercise their power of office reflectively. The reflectivity of institutional action is one of the crucial elements that the circumstances of uncertainty I've started to describe to you that are typical of action in an institutional capacity. I will be saying more to specify this type of uncertainty shortly. But these conditions of uncertainty related to the understanding of the raison d'etre of public institution as a work in progress require office holders never mechanically to apply rules, but always engaging in a reflecting exercise about which they ultimately ask themselves what is the point of their interrelated action and how by acting together they can actually uphold the working of their institution. In particular, it is crucial, in my view, of public institutional action that office holders are always ready. And when I say are, it's a normative are, they ought to be, as a matter of a normative ideal of how they should discharge their being public office holders. Ultimately, this is a consideration that characterizes an ethics of public office. They should be ready always to ask themselves whether the rationale of their action can be vindicated by reference to the terms of their mandate. So this is the idea of office accountability, to which I refer earlier on. And that ultimately requires something which I take to be very simple at the end of the day. It requires that as an office holder, when I act in my institutional capacity, I'm always vigilant to make sure that whatever I do is to the best of my knowledge and in the best possible faith I may have, contributing to the working of the institution. in ways that can be vindicated in this sense by reference to the terms of the power mandate, as I understand them, of course, always knowing that they can be contested and that this requires an engagement with the other office holders. So in this sense, this exercise, this reflective exercise, is not an individualistic exercise, but because institutional action is grounded on every office holders doing their part in this interrelated structural role, it is crucial that this reflectivity is there and it is dialogically understood as a matter. So the relevant question is, will I be able to justify to my fellow office holders what I'm doing with reference to my mandate in ways that is coherent with their mandate? This is the kind of ethical reasoning that I think is required for an institution to be operable in this sense. And if you look back at our initial scenario, it's exactly what is missing in the scenario there, or what Anne and Jenny better reciprocally think that the other one is not doing. And you already see how mistrust is sneaking in the picture, but we will see that better later on. Let me just specify that by this commitment to office accountability, I mean that office holders, because of this reflective engagement, are always conjointly responsible as an interrelated group of agents for the direction that institutional action takes, but they are also individually responsible towards each other for their conduct in their institutional capacity, precisely because they should always be engaged in this kind of dialogical effort. Now, I've already mentioned, but it bears emphasizing, that within this general architecture, the institution, raison d'etre, and the office's power mandates are mutable. Mutable in the sense it is suggested by the idea of institutional action as being a work in progress, which means, as I've already anticipated, that uncertainty is at the ground, is one of the very conditions of institutional action. And it is also a condition that enables office holder to take responsibility for the ways in which discharge their duties and the direction that institutional action ultimately takes. So let me now tell you something more in terms of the various types of uncertainty that characterize the institutional context and that are relevant because they set the circumstances of trust that make relations of trust between office holders both possible and necessary. So I see in the institutional context at work at least three types of uncertainty. I'm saying at least just because I'm really open to acknowledge other forms of uncertainty if you can think of more, but these are those that I've identified. This type of uncertainty derives from two main features of institutional action, which I've already presented. The first feature is the open texture of the formulation of power mandates, as we've already seen, and also a fundamental uncertainty about the capacity and willingness of institutional agents actually to abide by the terms of their mandate in a responsible way. So power mandates are uncertain themselves because, as we see, they are not fixed parameters, and these make my action as an institutional role occupant imbued with uncertainty. But there's also the uncertainty that derives from not knowing for sure whether the other office holders would abide by office accountability or not. So there's a more circumstantial or objective, if you wish, and interpersonal or subjective, if you wish, kind of uncertainty at work here. In particular, this uncertainty concerns some existential features of human action. So this type of uncertainty is not at all specific to public institutional action, but it stands for the very trivial consideration that relations between persons are imbued with uncertainty. I can never know for a fact that how other people will act. So this is a very, very basic consideration that we live when we interact with others, we are exposed to uncertainty, and this is very important, we are vulnerable to this kind of uncertainty, because it makes the formulation of our own expectations towards the other a very tricky matter. And this is a distinguishing feature of human interactions as opposed to interactions between persons and things. I'm much less uncertain that if I don't know whether you see me or listen to the presentation, but I'm holding a bottle in my hands right now. So I'm much less uncertain that once I open this bottle, I can actually drink from it than if I were waiting for someone, if there was someone else in the room passing the bottle to me. So ultimately, human relations are exposed to uncertainty. This is very basic, perhaps not very interesting, but it's there to acknowledge. There are other two types of uncertainty, which I think are more interesting and special to the institutional context. The first type of uncertainty is epistemic, and that concern the limited knowledge of institutional mechanisms that different office holders may have in institutions. This is especially the case in complex and large institutions where one office holder that working in one particular office does not necessarily know or have knowledge of the mechanisms that regulate the working of other offices in the institution. This may be the case in Anne and Jenny's scenario, where Anne, the doctor herself, I'm doing spectacularly well at remembering names. I hope that continues that way. So Anne, the doctor, is can never. We can imagine that she is uncertain about the exact details of the very specific mechanism that an hospital manager has to follow when she purchases drugs for patients, and this limited knowledge exposes Anne's action in her own institutional role to some uncertainty. She knows something, but we can easily imagine that she lacks the entire knowledge of what being an hospital manager can be. This happened to all of us when we start covering roles like the head of department or the head of school, and we realize all of a sudden, I didn't think it was so much work. So there's limited knowledge. But there's also some kind of normative uncertainty, which is interestingly typical of public institutional action. And that's the kind of uncertainty that derives from the ultimate vagueness of interpretation of the terms of different power mandates in the institution's raison d'etre. I've already said that there is discretion. There can be disagreement. So, of course, both Anne and Jenny in this scenario are using their discretion in their respective roles, and this makes the other ones understanding of their colleague action exposed to some uncertainty. But there may also be genuine disagreement between the two of them in terms of what should be the principles by which drugs should be bought in a hospital and therapies given to patients. So there's a degree of epistemic uncertainty which concerns the knowledge of institutional mechanisms, and the degree of normative uncertainty that is typical to the open texture nature of power mandates at an institution raison d'etre. This uncertainty is there, but it is moderate. It means that it is we can easily presume that office holders have some knowledge of the other roles within the institution. And this is a knowledge that might not be there in when we interact with other people outside of the institutional context. Admittedly, acting within an institutional context gives a structure to human interactions and gives content and lays the ground for much more predictability than when we meet with friends or meet a new partner introduced to us at a social dinner, for example. In these ways, the the actions and the terms of interactions are much less codified than in institutional context. So in the institutional context, there's some significant uncertainty that makes, and this is the next step of my argument, relations of trust between office holders necessary, but it also makes possible because there's at least some ground on which trust in each other becomes possible and makes trust different from a leap of faith. Now, we finally come to the idea of trust. So everything I said so far, I hope I set the stage and show you how the context of institutional interaction is such that it gives some structure to human relations, but it also leaves very wide margins for uncertainty. This uncertainty exposes office holders and make them vulnerable to each other action, and characteristically also make institutional action vulnerable to the office holders' action and discretion. In a way that to make institutional operational, so to make institutions able to work, this under conditions of uncertainty, it is necessary that public office holders share a degree of mutual trust in their ability to honor their commitments when acting in their institutional capacity. Regardless of institutional uncertainty, public office holders institutions work when public office holders trust their commitments, in particular to use their power of office in ways that can uphold institutional action. And the commitment to office accountability is the particular type of second order commitment that generally applies to all offices that compose an institution, in such a way that knowledge of this commitment provides the generalizable cognitive basis of trust among public office holders. And if you think back to the case of Jenny and Anne, you can clearly see, hopefully, or at least you can follow me in showing to you that in that case, this kind of lack of trust between Jenny and Anne shows that ultimately what they cannot trust is that the other one is as engaged in that kind of reflective exercise by which she could be able to justify the use of her power of office by reference to the term of the mandate. Jenny thinks that Anne is pursuing her own personal research rather than helping patients, and Anne is unsure whether Jenny is actually buying drugs in the best interest of patients or to please the generous funder of a recent luxurious congress. So ultimately, the point I would like to make is that although in the institutional context, we are deeply and fundamentally uncertain because we lack the knowledge, the epistemic type of uncertainty, and we lack of a normative compass to navigate the possible disagreements and different uses of discretions that office holders can make. Because the conditions are that way, it is very difficult to find a solid basis for abiding by one's own power mandates in the uncertainty that the other office holders are doing the same. However, if office holders can trust each other that whatever they do, and however seemingly odd their action might be, they're acting on their commitment to office accountability, we know that we are capable of correcting them when they come about, because ultimately we will be committed to upholding institutional action. And this is this kind of trust that I think is exemplary missing in the case I put to you. So in this sense, a public office holder, because institutional roles are interrelated, has reason to fulfill their role when their fellow office holders act likewise. Under circumstances of uncertainty, if public office holders trust one another, believing that each of them is committed to vindicating their actions by reference to their mandates, they are motivated to embrace their respective roles, knowing that they can hold each other accountable and engage in a process of correction of possible dysfunctions. So in this way, at the basis of my project, there's the attempt to link together institutional functioning, practices of accountability, and the trust, the mutual trust between office holders that these practices of accountability are capable of sustaining in such a way that mobilizes the resources that are internal to public institutions to react to institutional dysfunctions. And this is exactly what seems to be missing in the case of Anne and Jenny. Instead of calling each other, talk to each other and try to understand why the other one is acting the way. There's ultimately a disengagement of the two office holders in this practice of accountability. They're letting each other do their thing without discursively engaging with this practice, thereby showing a lack of mutual trust, which ultimately makes institutional action dysfunctional in ways that cannot be corrected by regulation, but requires an ethical commitment, an assumption of responsibility, ultimately in the hands of the office holder. And that, I think, is the type of trust that is cognitively grounded. It's grounded in the knowledge of the commitment to office accountability when institutions are well functioning, and that is missing in the occurrence of institutional dysfunctions. This type of trust between office holders, of course, as I anticipated at the beginning of the talk, is one possible type of trust that we can see among office holders, among the holders of institutional roles in public institutions. And is a kind of trust that has some distinguishing features. It is multilateral to begin with, because it's the kind of trust that binds together the complex network of interrelated roles embodied by the office holders, which is the first difference from the typical interpersonal relations of trust outside the institutional context, which are often studied and described as one-on-one relations, relations of friendship, familiar relations, relations of love. These are relations that typically, although not necessarily, but typically occur between two individuals. The institutional context make this dual relationship not as important, and in fact, beyond the point in terms of this cognitive view of trust, because of the interrelatedness of the institutional roles that require trust to be multilateral. Not only it's multilateral, but it's mutual. And this is another difference with relations of trust in the personal domain. In the personal domain, relations of trust can be meaningful, even when they are unilateral. I can trust my spouse, although my spouse may not trust me in return. In the institutional context, this is not the kind of trust that matters. It's not meaningful. The meaningful kind of trust is mutual, for the reasons I've explained, always because of this interrelatedness of institutional roles. It makes sense for office holders to trust the other office holders only if this trust is mutual, because it is embedded in this practice of accountability that require a mutual engagement. So, although they are relations of trust between office holders, are interpersonal relations because they are relations that occur between human beings. They are different from the relationships, the trustful relationships we entertain in other capacities, because they necessarily have these two distinctive features. They are multilateral and they are mutual. Moreover, they are entertained in institutional capacity. These are relationships that bind the members of institutional roles qua member of institutional roles, and have nothing to do with the relations of trust they may have in other capacities. However, so this is important because I think it allows to zoom in the architecture of institutional action as the context which explains and justifies relations of trust between office holders who act in their institutional capacity. However, because institutional roles are embodied, and they are embodied by flesh and blood individuals, it would be foolish to deny that the only considerations that matter in the institutional context are those that apply to office holders in their institutional capacity, because people may entertain relations that are also of different type and that they bring with themselves also in the institutional context. I am fortunate enough to be friends to some, even many of my colleagues. That doesn't change, of course, the duties of accountability I have towards them and the expectations and the way in which I can be vulnerable to direction in their institutional capacity, but brings something more, something different to our relationship. And in particular, in this sense, personal relations also matter. Which bring in also dispositional or affective grounds for trust between people, which may be grounded in goodwill. I may trust my colleagues out of my goodwill, out of my optimism, because I'm generally an optimistic person. It's not my case, but it's theoretically possible. Or affection, as in relations of friendship, or if I were to work with my husband. This type of relations focus on personal traits, and the presence of this type of relationship of affective or dispositional trust may also make a difference for institutional action. But how? I think that they make a difference in the context of institutional action in a way that tells something about the ways in which institutional mechanisms and institutional action can be actually dysfunctional. Because if you think about it, when you start trusting your fellow office holders to do their job, not out of their commitment to institutional action, but because of their goodwill, because of their good dispositions, or because of the affection they may have towards you, then it means that there's something wrong with how institutional action is developing. When I start relying on my colleagues as my friends, asking them to do something, because ultimately I trust them, but I trust them because I know that they are good persons. I know that they are my friend. So I know that I can ask them to fill in that particular form by tomorrow instead of waiting for my second or third or fifth reminder before doing so. Then it means that there's something dysfunctional with the institution. If anything, when we see that institutional action works because of the goodwill, because of the extra mile that individuals are willing to put in it, and the trust in your colleagues doing your work is not motivated on their professional competence, but their personal relationship to you, it means that the institution is not really working as it should. Why not? Because it is placing extra burden on the goodwill, and ultimately it puts in action relations of trust that are not healthy, because they distribute the burden of institutional functioning unequally on different office holders based on their personal dispositions, which have just drawing a reason, which have really nothing to do with their ordinary institutional role, and acting on that institutional role in a way that is ultimately responsible and ethically grounded in their commitment to accountability. So I think it is important to see, so this type of personal relations of trust, of course, can be a plus when institutional action works very well from the point of view of its own mechanisms, because it can facilitate it even more. But when it starts making up for failures of the other type of trust, then it means that institutional action is not operable in a good way. So to spot the presence of this type of relationship of trust, or better, to be able to diagnose where the kind of trust or the extent to which the kind of trust at work between office holders is personal rather than institutional, may have an important heuristic function to let us understand what type of institutional dysfunction is happening, and also to mobilize the appropriate resources for correcting it. That's why I think it is important to keep in mind all these spaces that trust may have in the institutional context, always being mindful of aiming for the institutional type of trust as a necessary, although not sufficient, condition for institutional operability. So in this sense, to conclude, the open texture architecture of public institutional action that I have presented to you requires and presupposes that office holders maintain mutual and multilateral relations of trust. These mutual and multilateral relations of trust have an important cognitive basis in the knowledge of the commitment to office accountability that office holders have. And the knowledge of this commitment gives the basis for office holders to trust each other that whatever they do, they will be able to engage in an exchange of reasons that is capable of taking stock of what they're doing with the power that are entrusted to their specific office and institutional role. When such relations of mutual and multilateral trust are absent or damaged, as in the case of the hospital manager and the doctor from which I got started, public institutional action is hampered from within, because public office holders lack the primary compass for navigating uncertainty and addressing institutional dysfunction. And I will stop here.
Thank you for this very rich and very relevant talk to a lot of the things we've been discussing so far. It looks like we have a good 40 minutes of time for questions and discussions. And we'll just start with taking questions and answers one at a time. Fabian?
Hi, Emanuela. Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed that. I have a question about your claim regarding mutual trust. So it strikes me that there are certain institutional roles for which that mutual trust actually goes against the role. So think about internal affairs officers, financial officers, sexual harassment ombudspeople. Their basic disposition, probably for good reason, should be to be slightly distrusting or skeptical, at least, regarding the role fulfillment of other people within the institution. So in order to do their work efficiently, it would be really good if we could trust them, the other institutional members, office holders, but it's not fully mutual in that way. And it seems to be inscribed in the role. And that raises a second question, namely the relationship. You now tied back the office holders' role to their mandate and to the raison d'etre of the institution. But those two possibly can come apart, right? Or they don't necessarily have to align super neatly with each other. So if I think about the financial administration in a German university, which I am fortunately quite familiar with, they interpret their mandate primarily in such a way that they say we're not allowed to squander taxpayers' money. And they actually very rigidly apply certain rules. And you said at some point, office holders, and I quote you, never mechanically apply rules. They actually see it as part of their institutional role to do exactly that. Now that leads to friction within the institution, no doubt. They don't like me and I don't like them, but maybe it's inscribed in their roles, right? So they actually also think that discretion is not necessarily a primary aspect of their role. Their role is to stick by the rules and make sure that those academics also stick to the rules and don't exercise quite as bit of a discretion as they maybe sometimes do. And I have lots of other questions, but I'm sure there are other questions in the room. Thanks.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, let me start. Well, let me start with the first question. I mean, I guess what you said in terms of certain roles in an institution's demanding the office holder not to trust the other in the institution, because precisely they have a role of control that requires them to be skeptical or hesitant. It's descriptively correct, but I'm not entirely sure whether I would picture that as a lack of trust of the kind I have described. So I don't think it must be necessarily the case for them, for this kind of people, for control office holders to exercise their role, that they must distrust the other office holders in terms of their commitment to office accountability. Because if that were the case, then we would be having a picture of public institutional action as grounded in a culture of mutual suspect, which would see office holders not as part of the same project, which is the project of doing something together through their institutional roles. So what I think it's required of these office holders is a certain level of alert. They must be alert of what their fellow office holders do. But being trustful of your fellow office holders doesn't mean to be to have absolute faith in them, never to question what the others do. Quite the contrary, the kind of practices of accountability I have described as the practices, the commitment to which is the object of trust, are practices by which office holders mutually, each of them in ways appropriate to the role, must be disposed always to take stock of what they're doing, to ask each other questions, to claim, to make the other take responsibility for their own action by vindicating the rationale of their action and showing and making a case of whether what they're doing is in line with their mandate or not. So in this sense, I don't really think it would be fair to say that inscribing the mandate of those occupying this role is a constitutive distrustful attitude towards the other, but alertness is necessary. But being alert doesn't mean to be distrustful in this very sense. Quite the contrary. If you take my main claim that a well-functioning institution is one where this type of practices of accountability is there, because this type of practices are exactly those through which office holders can call each other to respond for what they're doing. So trusting doesn't mean refraining from engaging critical thinking or let alone holding the other accountable for what they do. It means that unless there is something suspicious with their belief, normally you would simply trust that they are that they would be capable of indicating their action with reference to their mandate. And when it is your role to be asking these questions, then you will ask them without presuming at least the good faith of the other office holders, which makes a lot of difference, I think, because sometimes when you see how these control offices are established, that's certainly the case in Italy. You can clearly read in the policy behind that a lack of trust towards the office holders, a presumption that they're doing something wrong. And this presumption that they're doing something wrong and make them immediately act defensively rather than respond genuinely in a common effort to understand what is going on, sometimes can create self-fulfilling prophecies and create the conditions through which distrust propagates in a ways that impair institutional action. So the kind of trust for which I'm arguing doesn't entail, being blind to what the other people do. Allows for questioning, but allows for this kind of questioning in ways that does not necessarily, that can embed some presumption of good faith, which is compatible, I think, with performing this kind of job. Then, as concerns the mandate and raison d'etre, and the fact that certain roles are designed in ways that require automatic application of rules rather than reflectivity. Well, here, I think there is some discrepancy between what happens and what should be happening, where institution organized through the principles of accountability, which I'm defending. Of course, what I've given to you is a normative view of public institutional action and the ethics of office, and I think that from this very perspective, every time office holders think of the role as an automatic performance rather than a reflective exercise of a normative power, of a relevant normative power, then there is something wrong from the perspective of the ethics of office. So that shows that there are certain people that have views of their role within the institution that are not aligned with the commitment to office accountability, which is a problem. In terms of the ethics of public office I'm defending. And in this sense, the claim I'm making is not descriptive, but requires some kind of rethinking of about the role of the office holder. This degree of reflectivity, I think, is necessary every time you wield power. And of course, it comes in degree and depends on the type of role you have in the institution. I mean, some roles may be more meaningful than others because they come with larger powers and the larger capacity to alter other people's status and rights and duties. But it's a matter of degree. My basic claim would be that any office holder in order for any office holder to fulfill the roles in ways that are apt to the public function, this reflectivity is necessary. And when it is not there, there's a problem.
Hi, Manuela. It's Nicholas Kirby. How are you doing? So my question was very much the same, and I was thinking of exactly the same actors. I was also thinking of the democratic trust literature, which just speaks of the role of strategic forms of distrust in creating trustworthy institutions. So I think the same sort of logic might apply for a role for distrust internally within the type of agential institutions you're speaking of. It also seems there are many organizations where you can predict that over an aggregate, a certain number of employees will act contrary to whatever the commitments are of the organization. And it would seem silly not to have some sort of distrust-based mechanism to regulate them. To just have a default attitude of trust in that context would seem to be contrary to the raison d'etre of the institution. But my other question was, going back to your original example, it seems to me the problem here is not fundamentally a lack of trust, it's a lack of coordination between Mary and Anne. They just seem to be pursuing objectives that are somewhat running counter to one another. So they should coordinate. Now, they should do that whether they trust each other or distrust each other. In fact, trusting each other in this context would probably be the wrong thing to do, because it'd be like, look, I'm not sure what Mary's doing, but I guess she's got it, so I'll just leave her to do her thing. And Anne's thinking, I don't know what Mary's doing, but I guess she's got it, so I'll just leave her thing. And which goes to kind of tension I see between the idea of trust and accountability, because in order to want to draw people into accountability for what they're doing, you have to kind of trust that they don't have it, right? That we have to actually make sure that they do have it, and that we've kind of both got in your terms, we're both pursuing the raison d'etre together. Otherwise, I just assume that they are, and I won't hold them accountable. So yeah, there's kind of two questions there. One which is sort of following on from the first question, and another is about the specific example where it seems like I could just wash out the trust and distrust aspects and really just focus on the lack of coordination as the issue.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Wonderful. So trust is not, the kind of trust I'm discussing here is not blind. So it's not just like relying on someone signing off a blank check. It's quite the opposite. So the idea is that by doing what I'm supposed to be doing, I am implicitly showing that I'm trusting the others to do what they ought to be doing in their role, which doesn't mean that I'm never allowed, quite the contrary, to ask the others to account for what they're doing. So and here this sort of drives me to your second question. Of course, there is also lack of coordination there. No, we may describe that scenario as problematic from various points of view. But what is happening there is that Anne and Jenny are not doing. Let's take the kind of the side of Anne, which is easier. So Anne is not using the drug that Jenny has bought, and by not using the drug, she's showing that she doesn't trust Jenny. And this is the type of trust which is absent, which is exactly the opposite of holding Jenny accountable for what she's done. Holding her accountable for what she's done would mean prescribing the drug, but asking Jenny, I've noticed that this drug is constantly being bought, although we know that it has limitations. What is going on? So if there's a lack of coordination, this lack of coordination is shown by a lack of engagement with each other's performance of the reciprocal roles. And this engagement is manifested through a failure to act in ways that express trust towards the other. So this is the type of trust that I think is missing there, which is one component, of course, of what is required for institutional action to work. Then it is also true that in certain cases, trust can be misplaced, can be totally misplaced, because it can be based on a wrongful reading or interpretation of what the others are doing. And sometimes trust in others, especially when it is not associated with this commitment to reflectivity, which I insist is very important here to understand what type of practices are going on, may be detrimental because it makes people act on autopilot without actually missing the type of vigilant attitude I was referring to earlier on. So in this sense, I would really want to stress that this type of trust is not a blank check, and it does not go hand in hand with disengagement, but quite the opposite. So yes, that would be, yes, that's it.
Hi, my name is Haile. I'm from Western University. Thanks so much for your presentation. I think you mentioned in the beginning, if I'm not mistaken, that you did some work on institutional corruption. And I was just wondering if you could say more maybe about how this work on institutional trust might relate to institutional corruption. I'm thinking particularly about what you said in relation to how personal relationships of trust sometimes act as compensatory for this kind of absence of institutional trust. I'm wondering maybe you think that has to do something with corruption, perhaps, but yeah, that's my question.
No, wonderful. Yes, totally. So the argument on corruption I was referring to earlier on is the argument I've developed in the book on political corruption I've written with Maria Paola Ferretti, where actually we characterize political corruption as a deficit of office accountability, which occurs when office holders are not engaged in institutional relations for which they can account by reference to the terms of their mandate, but they start using their power of office for an agenda whose rationale is, in fact, incoherent with their mandate. And the argument we make in the book is that this type of corruption, so use of public power in ways that are incoherent with the terms of mandate, traces the common root to many manifestations of corruption that range from bribery to embezzlement, so individual forms of corruption, to more institutional forms of corruption, like clientelism or patronage systems, even state capture. And these are cases where the problem is a problem that we characterize in terms of an interactive injustice, meaning that precisely the logic of accountability, which is a public logic, that ought to regulate relationships between members of public institutions is supplanted by a different type of logic, which is frequently a personal or personalistic type of logic, which is, for example, if you think about practice like patronage or clientelism, it's exactly the kind of move that is made. So the relationships between a patron and their client do not respond to public principles anymore, but they respond to a personal and exclusive relationship, which may be based on economic or personal favors of sorts. So certainly, I would consider corruption, so understood as one of the institutional dysfunctions that reveal a lack of this type of trust. And in fact, restoring trustful relationships between office holders, insofar as they can empower office holder to stick to their commitments to office accountability, can be part of the therapy of corruption. And the therapy that, interestingly, in my view, uses resources that come from within the institution, and therefore does not reduce anti-corruption to legal regulation, punitive measures, external answerability, but actually mobilizes office holders to take on responsibility for the institutional dysfunction and try to remedy from within.
Hi, Emanuela, this is Kirsten. I was wondering a bit whether you could say a little bit more about the role that institutional design plays, because it's, so the thing that I was wondering about was that on the one hand, you said the role of we don't really need to rely on personal trust, but then it seems that we do need to rely at least on one trait that is kind of interpersonal, which is we need to trust that the other person has the commitment to fulfill the role well. And I was wondering whether that is the main kind of trust that we need in an institutional setting, or whether also there are certain types of institutional designs that we can trust into, so that even if we think or we cannot trust the commitment of the other person, we can trust that there are certain enforcement or control mechanisms, for example, that we can refer to in order to make the other person more committed, because there are disciplinary actions, for example, that we can take.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kirsten. I mean, I think that institutional design here matters in a specific sense. Okay, a few things on institutional design. So, in general, I think that institutional design, a good institutional design, is necessary, but certainly insufficient to uphold institutional action. Why? Because insofar as you follow me in seeing institutions as constituted by a network of interrelated roles enacted by human beings. However, you can design institutional procedures and mechanisms splendidly, but if the office holders do not act in ways that are characterized by certain ethical standards of the kind I've proposed, personal action is going to fail or derail or have problems. So there's so much you can do by way of institutional design. Rules, procedures, and mechanisms, although those are sort of a necessary condition because they constitute the backbone. Also because although I said that performing an institutional role is nothing like acting on a script, enacting a script, but is more like acting on a canvas. It's not improvising. And so institutional rules are important, and the design of institutional rules is important for institutional action to unfold, and also to allow office holder to formulate expectations over each other conduct that ultimately can be a ground of their trustful relationships too. But because institutional roles are embodied, there are limits to what institutional design, of course, can achieve, and that's where the embodied dimension of trust is necessary, and the office holder's commitment become relevant. But what I think is necessary, but it's not something that can be guaranteed by institutional design, although it cannot be reduced to office holders' personal commitment, is the regularity of certain practices. So the idea and the knowledge on the part of office holders that there are certain practices happening within an institution can give a certain context and stability to the office holder expectations. And these practices of accountability to which I referred, which may be, for instance, practices of mutual supervision between office holders, deliberative practices by which office holders can actually periodically ask themselves what the point of what they're doing together, and therefore exercise this reflectivity. In some other work, I've also defended that such answerability practices as internal whistleblowing can actually be practices that quite counterintuitively, if you wish, rather than showing distrust towards office holders, can motivate a certain type of trust between office holders, because they know that whatever they do, there will be mechanisms through which they can ask each other to give an account of their action in ways that will protect all of them and all their practices involved, which is something that you can achieve only if whistleblowing is regulated, is not left to informal or spontaneous declarations or revelations by single office holders in the institution. So I think that insofar as certain institutional practices can be consolidated, they create the context where this type of trustful relations can actually be grounded and reinforced, although this type of practices require the office holders' engagement and cannot be fully prescribed by rules that can be designed and enforced in a structured way.
Okay. Hey, Emmanuel, I'm Volker. So, hey. So this comes along a little bit like a provocative question at the beginning, but it's not supposed to be, because at the end you will see it's actually not so provocative. So I could not help thinking all the time during your talk about Eichmann. Okay, so the famous Eichmann from Arendt's book, The Banality of Evil. So to some extent, Eichmann, to my understanding, was just the perfect office holder. I mean, he fulfilled his mandate. He was committed to his mandate, and people could very much trust that he did what he did. I mean, that he fulfilled his role, right? But now Arendt would call this the banality of evil, simply. And you're supposed to give me a normative account of institutional trust. So the question is, if I would be wrong, if I would have been involved in the Nazi regime at the time, if I would have been, on your account, wrong to distrust Eichmann, even if he did everything, I mean, even all the conditions that you mentioned, he fulfilled them completely. And the point is that, you know, if you think about, liberal democracies, more or less institutions, they fulfill a scope which is ethically more or less legitimate. But if you go outside the Western world, most of state bureaucracies, people really have to fill sometimes really strange mandates, right? So isn't it that, something in your picture is missing, that even trust in institutions cannot be limited to simply fulfilling and being committed to mandate? There has to be an ethical component, which is to some extent prior to that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Volker. Before answering, let me just iterate. I'm sorry I am not to be there. I mean, I keep on seeing, nice faces, people I haven't seen in ages, all in the same room, and it's so bad not being able to talk to you more over these days. But this is, yeah. Well, my bad. Back to your question, Volker. Yes. So everything I said presupposes a background of nearly just or legitimate institutions. So in a way, you need a separate argument. So the premise is that there's a good reason to have the institution, and the institution may have some ethical value in terms of justice or legitimacy, in a way that makes wanting to preserve its well-functioning or its operability sensible. Of course, when you are in such a rotten and unjust regime as, of course, Germany under Nazi, but even not going that far, you may question that the very project of upholding institutional action makes sense. But that, of course, make all the discussion a fortiori perhaps not irrelevant, but it changes it substantially. So the premise of all this is that we have an independent reason, an argument which I didn't give because it was presupposed that there's a good reason to be to want the institution to be operational. If we want the institution to be operational, this type of trust is there, for better or worse. And in the case you gave me, it's just a case where arguably the institution was operational, but it was not good at all that it was operational. Quite the contrary, we would have wanted not to be operational, because the very end it pursued were unjust. So I guess that in the case you were describing, trust and trust are just not what is normatively at stake, because the question is what are the duties of office holders that work for within an unjust regime. And this is all the discussion on duties of resistance, civil disobedience, and various forms of principal contestation, which may actually require distrust, well-motivated distrust, but that would open a different type of analysis and require a different type of question. Because, you know, this is a type of discussion that from time to time comes when office accountability is discussed in the context of institutional functioning, and also corruption is, because of course one of the main issues that are frequently discussed in the case of when we discuss the duties of office holder is also what goes under the heading of noble cause corruption. So when office holders make a corrupt use of their power of office, because in so doing they're ultimately pursuing just terms that if they were just ends, that if they were to abide by their power mandate, they wouldn't be able to fulfill. And here the example always to take from the Nazim case is Oskar Schindler, for example, which is one of the sort of typical cases of noble cause corruption that is described. So I think that what you said is very relevant in terms of the type of reflectivity and the type of duties that office holders have within unjust institutions, in a way that makes the relations of trust I was describing not relevant anymore. So it would really change the nature of the investigation, the way I see it.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left and there's still 4 people with questions. So I'll collect all the questions and then we'll go from there, okay?
Sorry for being too long in my replies, but I'll take.
Scott Matthews from Memorial University, and this is more of a comment than a question, I think now. It started out as a question, but listening to your responses kind of addressed my concerns at one level. Because I think I find your sort of theoretical account of trust in institutions quite satisfactory in as a whole. But the example, I hate to belabor poor Anne and Jenny and their suspect practices in the hospital, but I mean, examples are helpful when I think the intuitions of your audience kind of align with where you want to take them. But my intuitions just really don't align with the kind of modal advice you want to give here. And I think it's because both Jenny and Anne have bases for forming really highly suspect perceptions of the other. I mean, these aren't trivial things. Maybe Jenny is taking kickbacks. Maybe Anne is violating her medical ethics and putting patient safety at risk. So, you know, engaging with each other about this seems to me would be actually quite dysfunctional for the institution. You know, hey, it looks like maybe you're taking kickbacks, Jenny. or I'm wondering if you are, that gives Jenny an opportunity to cover her tracks. I think the kind of response that I would want to see as a citizen concerned about what's happening in my public hospitals is way more robust than that, and that one that would be a little more suspicious of Jenny and Anne respectively. So I wonder if it mightn't be an idea to use a more kind of quotidian, an ambiguous, lower stakes example of this kind of interaction, because my intuitions about this, I would be very concerned if Jenny and Anne were so naive as to just, disclose their concerns first and foremost without addressing maybe some other actor in the institution, to each other, giving them this opportunity to perhaps continue to pursue, deepen their malfeasance. So that's my comment.
Hello, Emanuela. It's Margaret Moore at Queen's University. Hi. This might be just a kind of comment, but I will try to pose it as a question, although I understand you can't answer it. So both the doctor and a manager, have responsible jobs where they do have some discretion, but it occurs to me like not everybody has a same amount of discretion. So that made me wonder about the role of AI in institutions. Like you can imagine now there's a lot of artificial intelligence. So when you talked about roles and functions, that looks like AI can do it. When you talked about agents, it looks like that's a person. So now I'm wondering, as we think about, algorithms designing refugees matching to places and the role of AI in actually making sorts of decisions in institutional contexts, what this does to your theory, because it does look like they can fulfill functions and it looks like they can fulfill their role and it can be towards their mandate, but it doesn't look like they can exercise discretionary power. So I just wonder, so I was wondering how that gets incorporated, or if at all.
Hi, my name's Miriam. I'm from Carleton University in Ottawa. I think I'm an anthropologist, so I'll start with that. So I think I always struggle with sort of idealized theories when you're kind of thinking about how no institution probably functions like that in practice, right? So what does it actually look like in practice? I think what I wonder about is, so we just had a conversation about illegitimate institutions and how that might not fit the model. There's a lot of legitimate institutions that have negative effects on society, or that, reproduce inequalities in society. I guess I'm wondering about what are the roles of people within those, and how do we conceptualize this idea of folks who are playing their role in their institution and trust each other, but then actually having potentially nefarious effects outside. So I'm thinking, for example, of like ACAB, so all cops are bastards, in the Black Lives Matter movement, where it's not about an individual person doing something wrong in their role, it is part of that, but it's the fact that the actual institution creates roles that create negative effects in society in some ways. So that's in my mind. And also, yeah, I'll just maybe perhaps leave it at there.
So maybe we can give Emanuela maybe just 2 minutes. I know that's a lot of pressure, but as we were just on the cusp of out of time, but if you wanted to pick up on any of these themes or set them aside for later.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful, and it's just too bad there's no time to engage with them. But so the example, short answer is I'll rethink about it, because it's the third time I present the paper. 2 times the example didn't work, 1 time worked. So I'll probably try another one before changing it dramatically. But thanks. I take the suggestion. Margaret, AI, wonderful. So I've started. This is really interesting, and this one of the directions in which I would like my work to go. So there will be a paper on that. And I've started thinking about this in terms of the use of predictive algorithms in anti-corruption. There's a growing tendency in using algorithms to predict the risk of corruption associated with various offices, and based on that, anti-corruption actions and, for instance, investigations. And I have a paper where I argue that this is precisely going against these ethics of office accountability. So the kind of transformation of the ethics of office and the implications of trust of the use of AI is certainly a topic on which I would like to think more, because something's changing there. And it must be investigated. And Miriam, there's I think this sort of goes in the direction of asking what are more general duties of resistance of office holders that work not necessarily for illegitimate institutions, but also to institutions that present certain elements of injustice, as you said, reproduce, for example, injustices. And here there's but the question is a separate question, which concerns the terms of that may justify the contestatory uses of power of office by public servants, or, if you wish, office holders' disobedience in terms of a right or of a duty, which may be both an indicator of a lack of trust of the right kind within the institution, but also a condition where trustful relations are not appropriate, and therefore would be unjustified. Very quickly, but thank you. That were great points.
Thank you so much. It's time to go for break. Thank you, Dr. Seva.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Now we now have a 3-panel presentation. So we'll do 15-minute presentations from each of our panelists, and then we'll take questions at the end. First up, we have Ario Seto from Memorial University, and his talk will be on trust in a post-crisis society, the outsider-insider complex, regionalism, and self-reliance.
There you go. Perfect. Well, thank you, Kirsten, and the whole team for inviting me, because knowing that I'm not a political scientist, yet you still invited me, so I'm really thankful for that. My title of my paper's title actually changed a bit. So it's not the outsider insider complex self-reliance and but eventually regionalism. I'm going to tell you shortly why is it that I have to change my title. Perfect. Yeah, disclaimer. First, I'm an anthropologist. So basically, I have no clue what you've been talking about for the last 24 hours. So yeah, I'm still learning. So that's the first point. So just be kind. The second point is that I'm an outsider. As you could see, I'm Asian. I'm not from Newfoundland, and but I'm going to talk a lot about Newfoundland history. So if you have any questions about Newfoundland, please ask Keith, because he's been visiting here back and forth since 1990s, or even Amanda, my senior come from away scholar. So they know better about Newfoundland history than I do. And the third one is that in my paper, actually, I write the term Newfoundland and Labrador, but I actually never did any research in Labrador. So my research sites, there are 6 of them, are all in Newfoundland, so on the island. So, but just for simplicity sake, because I'm going to talk about the provincial government, I'm going to call it the NL government, so Newfoundland and Labrador government. But my research is actually based in Newfoundland. So why is it that I have to change my title? Because when I submitted my abstract, the Newfoundland government at that time were promoting and buzzing this idea of regional cooperation, regional-based development, and so on and so on. So in February 2022, last year, they were basically quite optimistic that we're going to have a new kind of regional development policy. And when my paper got accepted, and even when Kirsten reached out and then, can you please submit your abstract and stuff, I submitted my abstract. Apparently, last March, they decided that, no, we don't have any regionalization plan, right? So imagine if you have a student, and then this student told you that I'm going to submit my chapter by the end of this semester, and then the semester went by, and then the student said that, well, sorry, no chapter. So how do you feel about it, right? Distrust, right? And that happens so often. Policy change. More often, we call it here, policy change more often than the weather, you know. Imagine if this happened for like not only 10 or 2 years, this happened for 200 years. So how can you deal with this? How can you create trust when that is your experience in, you know, trusting someone else or an institution? So, but the funny thing is that when you come to Newfoundland, and what Newfoundlanders like to describe themselves is that they're nice people, right? So how is it that you cannot trust nice people, right? So because the thing is that when they talk about nice people, or when they have this concept about, you know, being friendly, actually they're talking about solidarity. Again, I'm not going to try to dare to define what is solidarity. That's Margaret's issue there. So what I'm going to do here, I just added the the AMIC definition last night after yesterday's presentation, is that how they describe solidarity is camaraderie, dealing with the climate, because people are saying that it's difficult to live here. So we're talking about geospatial based solidarity and the demands of economic survival. So we're talking about class here. So niceness, kindness is, it has class boundaries. And when we're talking about class boundaries, of course, we're talking about who is the other class, right? So in this, I'm trying to hint that the other class is the state. So what is the relationship between, common Newfoundlanders and the state? This is what I'm going to tell you in the next 3 minutes. But why is it, the question is that why is it that the relationship between the two classes is important? Because Newfoundland has the highest unemployment rates and Finns. BC is not even on the chart, so I don't know what you're doing in BC. So so we have the high employment rates. Income per capita is under national medians in 1970s. My colleague actually wrote a report and an article that distrust can hinder the possible potential of collaborative work to advance the province economic development, right? So now we're talking about policymaker, the other class, and the common. So I'm going to skip that because, that was just the outline of my argument construction. But I'm going to spend more time for the history. So, of course, all of you could read Wikipedia about the history of Newfoundland. The thing that I want to describe here a bit is that I'm not a historian either. So my wife is a historian, and we always argue how to create the periodization of Newfoundland history. But I'm just going to try to make it simple that we have the pre-1934 Newfoundland history, which is basically how Newfoundlanders describe themselves as the settler of the island and the province. So Europeans came to Newfoundland and Labrador to fish, right? But then that was not that easy, because what happened was that all the fishermen, they are connected to the truck system or the credit system. So the merchants and those who have the means of production, is very Marxist, the means of production actually control the livelihood of the fishermen. So the fishermen, they came here without nothing, without boats, without any equipment. So what they do is that they come to the shop or to the merchants, and then they say that, so can I get a bag of potatoes, boots, and a winter jacket and whatever, and then just put it on my tab, right? And then they go fish, and they, they're going to work, and they bring all the catch back to the merchant, and then the merchant will calculate. Somehow, it's always break-even point with the credit. So, of course, they got a bit of money, but a lot of studies say that, somehow they made it always, to the point that it only comes to break-even point. So there is no capital accumulation, there is no savings in the island. So because of that, McCann actually described the relationship between the merchants and the fishermen was very turbulent. And by 1880s, Korneski wrote that there is already a clear distinction in newspapers, in whatever communication that people had at that time, that there were two classes. The stereotypical narrative is that the fishermen say that the merchants are controlling our life, and they're working together with the government to make our life difficult. The merchants and the government describe the fishermen as they are not educated, they're difficult to deal with. Well, sometimes they're right. They're poor because they don't know how to educate themselves. So that was 1934. And then, of course, Newfoundland joined the Ally. And then they went bankrupt because they went to war, even though knowing that they did not have money to support the Ally. So they joined the Canadian Confederation. and with the hope that Canada will bank or will cover Newfoundland debt. Unfortunately, after they joined the Confederation, the government decided that these poor people from the outpost communities, they have to move to so-called centers of growth or growth centers. So that was what happened then after 1950s to 1980s was what Sider described as the largest forced resettlement in the global north. So I got the number somewhere, I think it's around 16 people had to leave their communities. They had to abandon their houses and move to a larger town. So that brought this kind of like discontent because, it's heritage, it's just place, and suddenly you just have to live it. And people, the government say that your life is going to be better if you move to larger towns, and if you're going to stay there, we're not going to provide any services. And they tried to deal with that. Okay, so that was the second blow in the history. In 1992, suddenly they everyone realized that the cod stock has depleted, no more fish to fish, so cod moratorium happened. Happened so quickly that one of my informants said that today I fished, and the next morning I couldn't because the policy happened. They wrote the policy overnight. Even though there are a lot of debates about that because some fishermen already warned the government since 1980s that, hey, our stock is actually depleting, but there was no action. So until 1992, suddenly they said that, okay, this is the time that we have to stop fishing, and we going to find other economic income from the province. So during those whole situation is that the government did not trying. So they tried different kind of methods. One of the idea is to have so-called rural development to bring economy out from St. John's, but to smaller communities. But again, the policy changed so often that it created a question whether the government or a policymaker, even I should point a finger to me myself, because they also ask if the university or the researchers are actually has a serious intention to work with us. That's the word that they're using to work with the rural communities. One of the ideas to bring back economy or to retrieve or to revive rural economy is through tourism. So this is a funny situation, because when everyone started to say, yeah, it's a beautiful place, and then we have to revive Newfoundland's economy through tourism. The problem is that if you go to rural areas, this is kind of situation that you see. And this is actually in Port Union. Port Union is, you could Google it, it's a very important city, and then you should visit it. And if you go to Port Union, this is the view that you're going to get, right? So they said that, okay, go to Port Union, it's very important. It has a historical blah, blah, blah from the world, blah, blah. Okay, it's great. But then when you go there, there's nothing about it. So what they do about that is that they start to support local organizations. They created businesses to create B&Bs, to create museum, and so on and so on and so on. And I have two examples here. I'm not going to explain what they did, because everyone could do that. The argument is that, why is it that community businesses could become so-called the intermediary of trust between the people, the common Newfoundlander, and the state? Is because when two people are actually having a conflict, somebody could actually move forward as the third party. And what they do is actually quite smart. When Newfoundland government or the policymakers always think about grants, supporting the community through grants, The way they see it, grants is actually a competition, because if community A gets the grant, community B will not get the grant, the money, right? So the government sees rural development as resource allocation. But PBSE in this context is the place-based social enterprise or community-based entrepreneurship, community-based organization. They see it that, okay, if community A could not get the grant, community B will get the grant. Why don't we share it? You know, let me apply for the grant, and then I'll give the money to community A and community B, and then we could share. So what they do is that they're trying to become an intermediary for the relationship between the state and the people through different kind of a complex interaction, right? This PPSC, because the government trusts 30 seconds. The government actually trusts the nonprofit organization because they see that this nonprofit organization is a smart organization that could control the community, right? And they could tap into government languages to, they do research, they do grant application, but still there's weak trust in that because I'm going to give you money, but you have to apply it every year, you know? So, what happened here is that when we're going to talk about trust, the two actors, they have different definition of trust. And what the nonprofit organization is trying to create a kind of a bridging of how both could actually come to the same language when they're talking about trust and cooperation or collaborative work or whatever work that they're going to do. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ario. Next up, we have Falake Oluwaku from the University of Ottawa, presenting Trust, Diversity, and the Integration of Black African Immigrants.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Falake, and I'm a doctoral student at the Ethics and Public Affairs program at Carleton University. And I am looking at social trust in relation to Black African newcomer immigrants in Canada. And I would really appreciate your comments and your feedback, your questions, because this is still work in progress. So any way I can improve it and make it better, expand on it, is very welcome. So the questions that I'm looking at are, do immigrants from sub-Saharan African countries pose distinct challenges with respect to integration in Canada? I'm also trying to see if social trust can be improved if we address, or if some of these challenges are addressed. And does that include anti-Black racism? And if so, how will immigration settlements and integration policy need to change if improving social trust is adopted as a core objective? And why are these questions important? I think that they are important because of the importance of social trust for individual and societal well-being. We've been discussing all of that here. And the area of the importance of social trust that I'm focusing on is social cooperation. The reason why I'm concerned about that is that newcomer immigrants from sub-Saharan African countries tend to originate from societies that are distrusting. This means that distrust tends to be very pervasive, it's endemic. And so developing like a distrusting attitude towards others then becomes an adaptive and pragmatic response. Also, I think that the, well, I don't just think, there is evidence that I will be showing you soon that the demographic of Canada's Black population is evolving. And so there is a need for us to look at certain things differently from how they have been looked at before. Now, on the importance of social trust and why I think it's important to look at it from this perspective, there is, there have been studies and of course different theoretical arguments have been made which demonstrate that in general, ethno-racial minority groups, they have far less social and political trust than majority groups in North America and in Europe. Also, severely divided societies are characterized by deep distrust, both socially and politically. The third point there is in relation to economic development. And studies have found that countries with lower levels of economic development have lower levels of trust. And as we know, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa are countries that are either, on medium levels of development or low levels of economic development. Also, citizens of countries in sub-Saharan Africa have low levels of social trust. This is based on studies that have been done. They have, citizens there tend to have high levels of particularized trust or trust that is based on ties to one's group, to one's in-group that is, or towards members of one's family, and high levels of trust in national institutions, with many displaying blind trust. So it is also highlighted in the literature, and I think that this is very important, that Black African immigrants have opposing attitudes towards social and political trust that is different from the attitudes that foundational Blacks have. And by foundational Blacks, I would be expanding more on who I'm referring to as foundational Blacks. So while foundational Blacks in North America have high levels of social trust and low levels of political trust, Black African immigrants tend to go in the opposite direction by having high levels of political trust or blind trust mostly, meaning trust that isn't critical, that doesn't question, and then low levels of social trust. Now, what this means is that not having all these issues around trust or being distrusting, trustworthiness, etc., even if it is just at the level of perception, it has the implication for newcomer immigrants in Canada, meaning that it compounds challenges that already exist. And some of these challenges have already, of course, been well documented in the literature. There are issues around racism, racial discrimination, isolation, etc. And also studies that have focused on Black African immigrants have found that they tend to suffer more from depression and mental health problems relative to other immigrant groups. So basically, there is some indication there to show that even though there are existing settlement challenges, then all of this, can be compounded by trust. Now, in looking at Canada's evolving Black population, in the literature, Mensah did a sort of like, he broke down the different phases in which Blacks arrived in Canada. So the first group, if we can look at it that way, are those who came through the slave trade in the 17th to mid-19th century, and then those who came around the Civil War. So those first two groups are those that I'm referring to as foundational Blacks, and the term is also used in the literature. And then the third phase, which is sort of like the group that I am focusing on in terms of those who come in more recent decades, first started mostly with Caribbeans, who came in the 1960s, around 1990s, and then mostly in more recent decades, Black Africans tend to come from, or Blacks tend to come from sub-Saharan Africa. Now, based on, this analysis was done based on the 2016 Canadian census. Third generation and above in terms of Blacks born in Canada who have parents who were also born in Canada, which I refer to as foundational Blacks, were, as of 2016, 8.6%, less than 10%. So you can imagine that this would continue to go down, and the numbers are likely going to be moving more in the direction of second generation and first generation Blacks. And first generation Blacks who were born outside Canada at the time were almost 60%, and they're mostly African. Now, what was interesting about the Black population that came out from that was that on average, not just is the population growing in number, it's also increasingly becoming more and more diverse. And it is on average younger than the general Canadian population. So while within the Canadian population, those below the age of 15 are 17%, among the Black population, it's 27%. Now, this is just to provide like a profile in terms of who are those coming into Canada. And since 2011, 60% are usually chosen under the economic category, 30% to unite families, and then about 10% tend to come in as refugees and asylum seekers. Of course, it's not always easy to divide these groups as clearly because they tend to be overlaps between them, but it's just to give us sort of like a picture of how in many ways immigration in Canada sometimes is like, has a different picture when compared to what obtains in other parts of the world. And currently, in terms of continents of origin, a vast majority of newcomers to Canada are from Asia first and Africa second. And then most newcomers who come from sub-Saharan Africa to Canada, they tend to be between the ages of 25 and 44, with a vast majority of that group being between 25 and 29. So, and this has implications, of course, for how we think about settlement and integration, because these are now new adult citizens that are coming in sort of like already fully formed in their countries of origin. And I think that this is something that should be of interest if it isn't already, because by the early 2030s, it is projected that Canada will rely on immigration for its population growth. Now, what can be done? I mean, I still have about 2 or 3 years to really fully flesh out what can be done, but just to give you some insights into, you know, some of what I'm looking at and how I'm kind of framing the issue. So I'm looking at the policy context and the whole, the way the policy looks at the underlying philosophy guiding the policy is the idea that immigrants are a means to an end. So Canada needs economic growth, it needs population growth. Let's bring people from, you know, other parts of the world. And in terms of how do we settle and integrate them, the idea is to have a whole of society approach. And just to be clear, because, you know, I know we had a discussion yesterday about integration. When I use settlement and integration here, I'm looking at it, you know, primarily from how the policy looks at it, which is mainly in terms of employment outcomes, you know, living conditions, civic engagement. So there are specific boxes sort of that need to be ticked in terms of once they are ticked, it's assumed, okay, you know, they're settled now. So in terms of the whole of society approach, of course, there is a lot of work that is being done in terms of the policy side, what is the role of the state, what is the role of the host community, etc. But I am looking at it from the perspective of newcomers themselves. And the reason why is because even though it is mentioned or sort of assumed within the context of the whole of society approach, I don't think it is very clear what that means for a newcomer. You know, okay, I'm supposed to play a role, but it's not always clear what exactly I'm supposed to do. And I think that one of the reasons why the policy isn't perhaps a bit more explicit on the role of the newcomer is because there are prevailing assumptions, you know, about how civic, we can call them civic virtues, we can call them civicness, however we want to, the ability to be civic, etc. There are assumptions about how these attributes, these civic attributes are developed. And they are based on the idea that through the market, as people seek employment, then, you know, their behaviors are shaped, or through civic associations, through the school system, or through the family. But these are all different spheres that, as you know, we know have evolved. And in relation to the school system, what does that mean if by the time an immigrant arrives in Canada, they are already beyond, you know, the stage through which they could have benefited from civic education in the school system? So what is the implication of this? I think that the implication is that we have, or we are increasingly having a situation where we have rentier citizens. And what do I mean by this? So I'm borrowing from the whole idea, or should I say I'm extending the idea of, you know, the rentier state, which has its roots, of course, in Adam Smith's conception of, or separation of rent from wages, meaning that even though wages are supposed to be earned, etc., rents are viewed as natural resources and, you know, are supposed to be are viewed as free. And this concept is specifically often used in relation to oil-producing states. So it's based on the idea that a rentier state is one in which they're dependent on oil as a natural resource. So people within such societies generally don't feel the need to actively contribute towards the state because resources are available. And citizens in those states are usually referred to as rentier citizens. So in using it here, I'm thinking, okay, so what happens when people from rentier states move to other states? Do they then still carry that same, you know, assumption, that same disposition? And how does that affect their ability to settle in the new states that they move to? And does it also affect other people's perception of them, of whether they can be trusted and whether they are trustworthy, etc.? So there is also this question of, you know, when people choose to migrate to Canada, is it really because it is about wanting to become Canadian? Really? Okay, is it really about wanting to become Canadian, or is it just based on the notion that anywhere is better than where I am at the moment? That also has implications. So I think what I'm building up here is there is an unanswered question for a newcomer, and that is, now that I am Canadian, who do I ought to be? It's not clear from the existing policy framework. So let me quickly move on to my tentative thesis. And so what I'm going with this is that enduring social trust requires a critical mass of good persons. Now, of course, this first sentence alone, there's a lot to unpack there. What does it mean to be a good person, especially in a multicultural context? Is it about prioritizing some notions of the good above others, etc.? So all of that, you know, is implicit here. So I also think that citizenship is local context specific, and it plays a prominent role in making us good persons, especially for persons who originate from societies where distrust is pervasive. I think that being a good person requires actively contributing towards bringing your society closer towards becoming a more ethical society. Of course, I have put "your" in quotes because there are different arguments about, you know, this now that, so I used to be Nigerian, now I'm Canadian, where do my dual obligations, dual loyalty? So there's all of that to unpack there. And so settlement and integration policy should play a role in facilitating this process for new adult citizens. And in doing so, I think that Canada would move closer towards viewing newcomer immigrants as intrinsically valuable and not just as means for economic and population growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Falake. Next, we have Miriam Hurd-Younger from Carleton University with her presentation, The Productivity of Mistrust, Negotiating Partnerships in Ghana's Development Sector.
Have we decided that this is better to hold than clip? You can probably clip it if you're not loud enough. Okay, okay, and I'll take it off. How's that? Can you hear me okay? Or is it better to hold? Okay. I'll speak louder when I actually. There you go. Yeah. Thank you very much. Getting that set up. So while she's getting it set up, I'll do my own caveats at the beginning. So also an anthropologist, that one applies to me as well. I think that's going to be kind of useful though, because I'm hoping that what my talk does is provide taking some of the ideas we've been talking about trust and mistrust and distrust and some of the policies and talking about how do they actually maybe play out in an everyday practice scenario. So I'm hoping that's what I'll provide. Another caveat is that I use the word mistrust, but perhaps those of you in the audience might prefer the word distrust for what I am speaking about, and feel free to kind of in the Q&A tell me that I'm using the wrong term, and I will be open to that point. And I also think there's an interesting aspect on the relationship between trust and accountability that we were kind of getting to in the discussion after the keynote this morning. So I think that will be a good through line. All right, now my time's just starting now. That doesn't count towards the time. We all cheat in different ways. Some steal time from others and some just. All right, go ahead. So, I'm going to start with just arrows don't work. Okay. With a point from the 2018 UN Secretary General. He opened his address to the General Assembly of the UN. That's what it looks like, very gold and ostentatious. And he said that the world is suffering from a bad case of trust deficit disorder. And then he ended his talk saying that he promised to repair broken trust. So basically he was setting up the premise that global collaboration is weakening and the development sector is suffering for that reason, and we need trust as a way of addressing those problems. Now that kind of statement at the very highest level of the development sector does reverberate down into policies and practices, and which is what I'm going to talk about today. And one of those is the idea that partnerships and trusting partnerships are really required to address inequality and poverty. So I study how non-governmental organizations in Ghana, in West Africa, so NGOs, if you don't know that acronym, I turned the page too early, what am I doing? How they actually enact what they call trusting partnerships. And as an anthropologist, my research is based on ethnographic research, so long-term participant observation. And this research is based on research with a network of NGOs that was building these trusting partnerships. So I worked with the network for a year and a half, and also did qualitative interviews with their partners and with the members of the network as well. So I'm also going to talk about mistrust / maybe distrust, and because what I was surprised to find in studying how this network enacted its partnerships was that practices of mistrust were really important to their success. And that's what I'm going to kind of share today. And my proposition that I'm going to kind of come to at the end is that perhaps we want to avoid thinking about trust as this ethical good and mistrust as its bad opposite, and rather look at how they can actually be practices that have effects in practice, and some of those effects can be good on both sides. So a bit more of the context. the current president of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, when he came to power in 2017, he put forward this vision for the country, which was to develop an optimistic, self-confident, and prosperous nation through the creative exploitation of our human and natural resource, and operating within a democratic, open, and fair society in which mutual trust and economic opportunity exists for all. He's been dubbed the King Promise for his nice sayings and vision statements and things like that. I had the opportunity to ask one of his senior officials about this statement and what it actually meant. And this official said to me that it actually came down to the fact that they felt, as a government when they came into power, that partnerships had been missing in development efforts so far. So they were going to work really collaboratively, they said, with civil society and with private companies to work towards the economic opportunities for all. And one of the ways they were going to do this was in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Sorry for development speak, but this is the world that I live in. So the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, are 17 goals that the UN set in 2015 that are supposed to be in place till 2030. And all of your countries are also supposed to be implementing these goals. So it doesn't just, the previous goals applied only to quote unquote poor countries, and these ones actually apply to every country, including Canada. And the 17th goal actually requires that the goals be implemented through partnerships. So they're even embedded into the goals themselves. And these partnerships are often called multi-stakeholder partnerships, so between private companies, governments, and civil society. I'll give another quote here from another government official who was explaining how these partnerships actually work, or, you know, in her proud kind of statement about the effect of these partnerships in Ghana. And she said that the strong partnership that exists between government and civil society organizations who were working to complement each other, complement with an E, not an I, important distinction, in the structures the government put in place, had resulted in the reduction of mutual mistrust. So these partnerships are kind of touted as a way of building trust across these sectors. Today I'm going to look at this corner of the partnerships of government and NGO relationships, and specifically how NGOs position themselves within them. So that point about complementary is important because the ways that NGOs position themselves in this partnership and that network that I did research with was trying to lead civil society efforts on this partnership with the government. They talked about their role as being complementary to government. And they did once send out an email that said complement with an I, and it became this whole like drama thing. But anyways, they part of that role they saw as two aspects. One, to make sure that the efforts to implement the SDGs were actually reaching the poorest of the poor and the most vulnerable in Ghana. And then the second aspect, which is what I'm going to talk about, is that they saw their role as a watchdog. So it's holding government accountable to actually achieving the commitments to the SDGs. The challenge that they found out was that, oh, okay, if we're going to really collaborate with the government and actually implement these goals together, how do we still play that watchdog role? How do we like work together but stay arm's length enough in order to hold the government accountable practically and in perception of the public perception to be able to hold that role? And that was a big debate among the members of this network who were trying to figure out how to maintain those two positions. One of the points of debate was about whether to accept funding from the government. So an example, in 2019, the government actually invited members of civil society to be part of their official delegation to the UN when they were reporting on progress on the goals at this big UN forum in New York. And the civil society members went as part of this delegation, and it was hotly debated amongst them whether they should ask the government to help pay for their hotels and their flight in New York, which is very expensive. In the end, they decided not to, and they were quite proud not to, because when they came back to Ghana, they said to me, oh, when we got to the UN, so many other NGOs who were there from other countries saw how they were collaborating with the government so closely and at all the government events, and kept asking them multiple times, like, have you guys been bought? Are you bought out by your government? And they were very proud to be able to say, no, we didn't accept any funding. So we are uncompromised on that aspect. Another example, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, is about food. It's a little bit more subtle. So if you kind of picture yourself in a boardroom in Accra, it's like brightly lit, kind of looks like this, except without the auditorium style. The delegation from New York came back to Accra, and they reported back to their network of NGOs, how did it go with this big forum in New York? And one of the prominent directors of one of the national NGOs in Ghana stopped the whole update meeting and said, okay, everyone just stop. I need to tell you something that happened in New York. So everyone's like, uh-oh, something happened in New York. And he said in a commanding voice that in the name of transparency, he needed to tell them that he had gone to a government side event in New York. There's all these side events. It's a very bureaucratic event with multiple events in it. And because the government was the partner, he felt like he had to go to this government event. It was at the end of the day. He had been very hungry. And so he ate food at this government. So like me, the anthropologist in the room typing away, you might have been like, oh, what, confused, you know, why do you need to make this confession? And part of my confusion came from because John, as I call this person, was a big advocate of this partnership. He felt like this was a chance for his prominent NGO to even gain more influence by working with the government and actually being able to influence some of their policies by implementing these goals together. So he was very excited about this partnership. And he had described it to me as a way of building trust with the government, who often mistrusted him because his NGO often, you know, called them out on things that they did wrong publicly. So how can we understand this confession that he's making? So despite my initial surprise, I came to realize this confession is very illustrative of the kinds of negotiations that NGOs have to undergo to be complementary, but not compromised by their partnership. And compromise was often the word that they used that they wanted to avoid. So after his confession, he added that he was worried that pictures could have been taken of him eating at this event and that those pictures would circulate in the media back in Ghana. And he said that it was, quote, an ethical thing to consider. And he asked his colleagues, quote, when we go to such events, do we want to go to the extent of eating from government? He then recommended that all future government events, they never eat again, and that you have food before and you don't eat at any government event. So stepping back, I want to just talk for a moment about the social importance of eating. You know, the anthropologist in the room, basic everyday practices like eating have a social significance in terms of power, relationships, meaning. And I'll kind of add 3 types of ways of thinking about that. The first is that in a prominent Ghanaian language that's spoken in the south of Ghana called Twi, the word for trust is jedye, which translates to receive and eat. So J is to receive and D is to eat. So to trust someone is literally to receive from them and to ingest it, to take it in. So eating and trusting are kind of very coexisting in that, even in the language and the linguistic way of thinking about trust in Ghana. Another way of thinking about this is through the practice of giving the gift. So if you've ever taken an intro to anthropology course, gift giving is like the classic, you know, Marcel Mauss study, which is basically that no gifts are disinterested. When you give a gift, there's an expectation of reciprocity, and the exchange denotes a relationship. Think about it in terms of your last Valentine's Day, your gift that you gave and the quality of the gift, the cost means something for the relationship. If one person gives a diamond ring and the other person gives a chocolate bar, there's consequences for the relationship in that sense, to just put it simply. So we can kind of think about this in this moment as well, that he said, do we want to go to the extent of eating from government, you know, accepting a gift from the government and ingesting it, taking it in, that has a symbolism for the relationship. And broadly interpreted, there could be expectations of reciprocity, whatever that could mean. So taken together, the accepting the gift of food, consuming that food denotes a positive, trusting, or not necessarily positive, but a trusting relationship with the government. So here you might be thinking, well, didn't they publicly talk about their relationship as building trust and talking about building partnerships? There was press releases that said they were building trust by having this new partnership. It was in the vision, the national vision. So yes, but I think here is where we kind of see the limitations of talk about trust as the only aspect of a relationship, and without thinking about the broader or the other kinds of social relations, politics, and dynamics in which trust can coexist. So yes, John was building a trusting partnership with the government. He talked about it as trusting, but he was also really concerned with maintaining his ability to be a watchdog and to be uncompromised by that partnership, to be too trusting, perhaps. So to go a bit further, and this will also ring true for Nigeria as well, Eating is also highly saturated with ideas of corruption in West Africa. I don't know if you would agree with that, but so there's a common other language called Pidgin, which is spoken in Nigeria and in Ghana. And the word for eating in Pidgin is to chop. But the word for corruption is also to chop. So eating is highly saturated with ideas of consumption in terms of both food, but also consumption in terms of money or corruption. So here's a little cartoon that, from Ghana just last year, where it depicts politicians who are eating, but also taking money as a way of kind of signaling corruption together. So John was worried about pictures being taken of him eating and circulated back in Ghana. He was not concerned necessarily about corruption in terms of doing something illegal in this moment. It's not illegal to eat free food at a government event, but he was worried more about corruption of his public image of being uncompromised and losing that perceived integrity to hold the government accountable. So maybe perhaps thinking about it as being corrupted versus corrupt might be a way of thinking about that. So, you know, you might be tempted to kind of write off my reading of Jedier and chopping as just kind of fancy anthropological linguistic wordplay that we like to do. But I think it is important to think about the social context of what trust means in context. So the word for trust as tree as eating, but also eating as corruption, points to the social symbolic importance of eating in Ghana and how it can be interpreted in different ways. So because of that interpretation, I think we can also then interpret John's recommendation not to eat at government events as a recommendation to show mistrust of the government, as a practice of mistrust. So not eating is a practice of mistrust. Refusing food from someone is a practice of mistrust. And he was asking his colleagues to make sure that they were showing some distancing, some wariness in their relationship with the government, especially in terms of a watchful public. So here I want to just wrapping up towards my conclusion, Rachel, so don't worry. I would caution us against trying to figure out, I don't think my point is to figure out, well, did John really trust his government partners? Did he not trust them? And, you know, can get into the actual, you know, day-to-day part of their partnership. I think the example is more to illustrate that practices and talk about trust and mistrust can have effects in social relationships, do things in the relationships. So on one hand, one of the things that the trust talk did, the talk about building trusting partnerships, is it aligned John and his NGO network and the government with UN policies. It made them, you know, do good development practice, bringing more donors to Ghana, for example. It gave John more influence also by actually being able to collaborate with the government and have some of his voice be within that implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. But on the other hand, the practices of mistrust, the idea of not eating, also kind of helped to position his NGO within that partnership as holding some integrity and some ability to hold that accountability role. And I would argue that both those practices were actually very essential to the success of the partnership. And it was very successful. Even Canada, countries like Kenya actually sent delegations to Ghana to learn from this partnership approach that they were enacting. So globally, it was considered quite a success. So to reflect back on the UN Secretary General's point about, you know, a trust deficit disorder, and that mistrust can be an indication of a global disorder that we're all suffering, I think that a sole focus on trust is the only good thing misses some of that positioning and maneuvering that happens in everyday politics and everyday relations that are not always a bad thing. Showing mistrust can actually be a good thing and can actually help you enact those global policies like trusting. And sometimes balancing practices of trust with practices of mistrust can be as simple as whether you want to eat hors d'oeuvres or not. Should we all eat the cookies at coffee? I'll let you kind of think about that. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to moderate?
All right, so we have about 30 minutes for questions for all three panelists. So if we want to have any questions. Okay, so, and then Mills and then Anna Marie.
Okay, thanks. So this is for Folake. So I was interested in what you said about immigrants from low trusting sub-Saharan African countries. So do you know of any studies that look at what Canada does to trust levels, so differences between trust levels in the countries from which they come and trust levels when they've come to Canada? So I mean, there's some evidence, I guess, especially from the Scandinavian countries, that suggests that certain types of institutions raise trust levels for immigrants that come from low trusting countries. So in particular, institutions that are perceived as impartial, non-corrupt, have tend to have universal benefits and so on. Significantly decrease gaps in trust levels, both institutional trust, but also interpersonal and generalized trust. So I was just curious about, do you know of any studies from a Canadian context that look at what being exposed to Canadian institutions does to trust levels, if anything?
Yeah, not that I know of. Not that I know of. There might be, but much of the evidence that I've been looking at has been those, similar to the ones you've mentioned, and yeah, it would be helpful, definitely, for my work if I were to be able to find studies like that. I will keep searching, but not that I know of at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I also have a question for Folake. One is also just a mere question about whether you have any idea whether there are reliable statistics, what kind of employment the people take up, the immigrants. So the, what was it, 56.4% who are first generation immigrants. I would be interested in those. And then the second one, there's obviously a danger, because I work on a social ethos, that it's a little bit like you have a hammer and every problem looks like a nail. But what you described on your last slide sounded like, you might need a different kind of ethos rather than a very instrumental relationship, have a particular shared vision. And that also changes the very meaning of the question, which you posed so nicely. Now that I'm a Canadian, who do I ought to be? Because if I'm purely perceived to be an instrumentally attractive immigrant to solve a very particular problem, that question most definitely will be answered quite differently than if I'm a fully participating and contributing equal member of society. And so what kind of role informal social norms and these kind of shared visions of society would play, and how you will actually deal with that, because that seems to be quite a big step and away from just looking at policies. There seems to be quite a bit of attitudinal change needed, let's put it that way.
Should I respond? Okay. I agree with you, that there is definitely a strong attitudinal component there. I'm hoping that that can be worked on through the work that I will be doing, but I'm also trying to see how policies can facilitate that. So that's kind of where the bridge lies. And I agree with you completely on the whole idea of having a shared vision. I think it's very important that newcomers see sort of like the Canadian project, as imperfect as it is, as an ongoing project that requires their involvement, their engagement. We should see ourselves as we're now all in this together, because that in itself builds trust. If people have already invested their tears, sweat, and blood into something, if I also come and I put in my tears, sweat, and blood, then they're more likely to trust me, as opposed to I watch them do what they're doing and then they're suspicious of me. Will I sabotage the system, etc.? So I think that there is a trust implication there. And then on the issue of employment for first generation immigrants. So there are no studies that have been published, but so I would call this anecdotal because, just from focus group discussions, etc. There is a lot of majority increasingly find themselves in the care industry, as it were. So personal care industry, which has implications, that I've also been thinking about how that can factor into my work. But that tends to be sort of like the first rite of passage into the Canadian employment system. Regardless of the skills that people come with, they find themselves having to, engage in personal care, and then some eventually move on to something else, some don't. And that becomes what they do. So yeah, there is, yeah.
Thanks, and apologies to the other two panelists. I also have a question to Folake. It's an interesting project. My question has to do with how you described what kinds of attitudes of trust do the new Canadian citizens with sub-Saharan African origin have, and how you built the picture is that, well, they have low social trust, they have high particularized trust, and then high, even blind trust in national institutions. And I'm presuming that what you are talking about here is that the direction of trust is that what do the citizens, the sub-Saharan African origin citizens, how do they relate to others? Do they trust others? Do they trust institutions? That's the direction of trust there, right? So of course there might be different kinds of explanatory factors explaining why this is the case, why they have low social trust and sort of blind trust in national institutions, and some of them might have to do with the differences in their countries of origin to how the situation is in Canada. But you also mentioned that some of these how the trust plays out might come from what is happening in Canada. So for example, racism, prejudice, attitudes towards the new citizens. And I think that, for example, racism and prejudice might help explain why there is low social trust. But I'm super intrigued why that doesn't travel to trust in national institutions, because much of racism is institutionalized racism, is structural racism, but it seems that the experience of that doesn't affect the blind trust in national institutions. And I'm wondering whether you have any view, or whether you know of studies that might be explaining why the institutional racism that they surely experience, why that doesn't affect the high blind trust in national institutions. And a second question that I think relates to this is that how I saw your project is that what you want to be focusing is the problem of low social trust, and how do we get the social generalized trust higher by national policies and so on and so forth. But it seems that that's not the only problem. There might also be a problem of blind institutional trust. And it might actually sort of semi-ironically be the case that in order to increase social trust, we also need to aim to lower the blind high institutional trust.
I agree with you that to improve social trust, something has to be done about, the high blind institutional trust. But I think I should also clarify that among the studies that I showcased in that slide, there are two separate studies. So one of them was done on citizens of Sub-Saharan Africa in Africa, not here. The one that shows that they have high blind trust. So they have high blind trust in Africa, and they have low social trust and high levels of particularistic trust. All of this is done in their countries, yes. However, there is also a study that shows that, at least in terms of social trust, it does translate that immigrants from racialized minority groups generally tend to have lower levels of social trust. So there is kind of like that, one can, I guess, assume that there might be that connection that, okay, if you've already sort of developed an attitude of low social trust, then it doesn't matter where you go, you might carry that attitude with you. So there is that aspect of it. And I also wanted to, you asked the question about racism, you know, that one would expect there should be sort of like less blind trust towards institutions, especially those that are considered to be racist. So this is where I think it's important to look at Black African immigrants as a distinct group, because I also found it interesting that, so for instance, African Americans, Black Canadians who are more foundational, have been in North America longer, they generally tend to have lower levels of institutional trust. But Black African immigrants, on the other hand, tend to have a different, you know, an opposite view. So you would think, I guess where we're going with this is how can they be then more questioning, as opposed to just assuming perhaps that an institution might be racist towards them. And maybe it is not, maybe it is, maybe it is not. But if I don't question that institution, how would I know for sure, right? So I might be excluded in ways that are racist. I might be excluded in ways that are non-racist. But it's through that process of engaging with that institution that I might be able to find out, oh, okay, maybe they just hadn't had anyone like me before, and now they do, and maybe they just need to adjust their policies to better incorporate me. So that's different. I don't know if that clarifies things a little bit. Okay, thank you.
So we have a lot of questions, so we'll start grouping them by two. So yeah, we'll start with you.
Okay, well, I found this fascinating. Okay, so I found this fascinating, and I actually will ask a couple of questions, if I can sneak them in. One for Miriam. I'm going to push your anthropological instincts. Please. And ask how far you would extrapolate from the experience that you described. Because much of the discourse about trust is that this is generally a good thing, that it facilitates cooperative behavior, that economies work better if you have high levels of trust. And yet, on the other hand, we know that trust levels on average vary across countries, that in France it's much lower, but actually France functions as a place. And so I'm wondering whether I can tempt you to draw larger conclusions about the relative utility of trust and mistrust in social affairs generally. That's a challenge, but actually I had a second question for Foloke, but she anticipated. I was wondering how much leverage you could get for your questions by comparing foundational Black communities and immigrant Black communities, and you've used that very effectively in your last answer. So the related question is, to what extent do the two communities, foundational and recent immigrant communities, have similar priorities and policy or goals, and to what extent do they and can they collaborate in political agency, or are their goals so separate that they operate independently in terms of political agency?
Thanks. I really enjoyed this panel, so thank you all for your talks. I do have a point or question for Miriam, and it's really kind of a conceptual, again, philosopher's point. So, so you talked about how trusting or being seen as trusting can be compromising, and used the example of someone in a position of a watchdog, and I think that seems entirely right. And I think you want to say that mistrust is sort of better when you're in that role because of that compromising nature of trusting. And I just want to encourage you to think about a third possibility, which is just indifference. So, trust philosophers talk about how trust and distrust are contraries. There is a space in between them. You don't have to have an attitude toward someone's trustworthiness or untrustworthiness. You could just be indifferent. So there is that possibility. You don't want to be trusting or be seen as trusting, but that doesn't mean you have to be mistrusting or seen as mistrusting. You could be kind of impartial or indifferent. So, what is the right attitude then for the watchdog? Maybe it is mistrust because they're a watchdog, but not everyone in an official position like that has to be mistrusting if they can't be trusting.
Okay. Thanks so much for the questions, and appreciate the push to generalize or extrapolate beyond my contextual research. I do think that, so I think I'll answer it in the Keith, your question three ways. I think on one hand, I think that the position of non-governmental organizations to try to be perceived to be uncompromised by their partnerships with government is one that can be extrapolated. And I think we can think of some examples in Canada just in the last, couple of years, like the We Charity and the total scandal with being perceived to be too close to the Trudeau government, unable to play its non-governmental role for that reason, or even, David Johnston's recent, having to resign because of also being perceived to be too close to government. So ideas of like conflict of interest. And I think in those contexts, I think we could still think about practices of mistrust as a distancing or a practices that allow you to be perceived as skeptical and distanced, and not having a conflict of interest as useful in those kinds of contexts as well. And that's why I think my approach to this idea of mistrust is more of a practice than as like a internal feeling, that it's a practice that you can have in social relations between people. And I think another piece of that I would also take away and that you can extrapolate, hopefully, would be thinking about what is mistrust actually trying to do. So if you took my paper the opposite and you started with the idea, well, the government mistrusts, then John mistrusts the government, you could be like, oh, that's probably a bad thing. But then you want to think about, well, why is he doing that? So in terms of COVID vaccines, for example, at the very early onset of the pandemic, there was a lot of worry, oh shoot, people are mistrusting the vaccines. Like, why aren't Black populations in North America taking the vaccines at the same rate as white populations? And there was a lot of like, well, there must be something, wrong here. And I think this goes to your talk yesterday as well. And then it took like, a couple days or weeks for the media to start saying, oh, actually look at this history of, scientific medical experiments on Black communities in the US that create a history of mistrust. So I think my point being that rather than thinking that, well, the mistrust must be a bad thing, trying to understand where it's coming from and its historical roots, and what it's trying to achieve for the folks who are practicing it, might be a way of like an analytical frame to think about mistrust, I guess, that could be extrapolated. Conceptually, on the indifference piece, it's interesting. I think I would almost, rather than indifference, perhaps another word would be ambivalent. And I think I did see that, I did see that quite a bit in my observations of how this network operated. And an example would be the network members themselves. So in my dissertation, which hopefully will one day become a book, there's a chapter on NGO partnerships with government, private sector, their donors. So I'm kind of interested in Arya's work with the paperwork aspect, and also with between members. And between members, there's a lot of ambiguity because they did in some ways trust each other, but then they were also in competition for funding and mistrusted each other on that. And then in some ways, they also didn't care that much about some aspects of the partnership in ways that John might have cared about as a leader of this network. So depending on their position and what they were trying to get out of the network, they could be ambivalent or mistrusting or very trusting, depending on kind of what their position was. So thanks.
Yeah, so the difference between whether there are differences between foundational Black communities and Black African immigrants in terms of collaboration and similar goals. So from what I have gathered from the literature, the answer I would give would be a yes and a no. So the yes part is because there is sort of like a general understanding or encouragement sort of that Black communities, regardless, or should I say Black persons in general, should rally around the whole issue of combating anti-Black racism as a group, regardless of their origins. So on that front, yes, that sort of seems to be where the whole idea of Black solidarity and all of that tends to be seen as a common goal. However, when it comes to pursuing other more common political goals, there is evidence that from studies done specifically in the US that I have seen, where it was observed through different sort of ways in which Black communities engaged politically with the American government. They found out that foundational Blacks were more interested in Black participation in the US, whereas African immigrants tended to be more outward looking. So they were interested in engaging with the American government in relation to the situation with their country. So that tended to be the pattern of political engagement. And that sort of like marked the difference, yeah.
So I put myself on the list. My question is both for Miriam and Setu. And it's less of a question and more of a, can you say more about this? Because I thought your two talks complemented each other quite well, because you were both describing in a certain sense an intermediary between government organizations or international organizations and the population, and how that puts, so maybe I'm misinterpreting, but in a certain way, I thought that what you're describing, Miriam, with distrust towards the government was also in order to establish relations of trust with the population. And that also seems something that Setu was talking about these intermediaries as having bonds of trust in two directions. And so I was wondering whether you can say a little bit more about how trust and mistrust kind of, how these actors kind of balance these things to have trust relations in both directions through engaging in practices of mistrust, and in what way, and whether that is the same in Newfoundland as well as we've seen in Ghana.
Yeah, I'll just.
We're just going to take another question.
So I pretty much had the same question, except just for Ario. So I was wondering if you could just describe, or if you had an explanation for why that the PBSE could take on this intermediary role. You know, is it because they're local? Is it because they're, but then that doesn't explain sort of why they're so successful with the government? Is it because they're staffed by, you know, quote unquote townies, and so that makes them successful with the government, but not with, that would complicate things with the, you know, the outport communities. So if you could just describe a bit more about how it is that they became, or why you think they became this, to have the successful role as an intermediary.
I'll just say quickly that I think the audience does matter, especially when we're thinking about like practices that are trying to have effects. Who are they speaking? Who are those practices speaking to? So I think in the example I gave, you can think of 3 audiences, at least I do. There's probably more, but you know, an international UN audience, when you report on progress towards the SDGs, donors of Ghana complimented Ghana after they reported on their progress to say, wow, you guys have done a great job developing trusting relationships. Like we are proud of you. Like, anyways, the donor relationships are something else that we can get into. Then there's the third one, which is the second one, sorry, which is the government showing trusting relationships to have a collaborative relationship, but then also wanting to have a third audience of the public and what does the public perceive the NGO to be, and therefore having to have some practices that showed a distancing. So the NGOs really do have to walk a tightrope line, and folks like John are very like savvy professionals in figuring out who are the audiences at different moments, who are going to perceive them at different moments, and what practices should I use in this moment in order to play my role effectively in all the aspects of my role, because I have many aspects in my role. So yeah, some of the NGO staff were better at it than others. John was very good at it.
Perfect. I'm going to answer both question at the same time. So yeah, there's a kind of like an interplay between trust and mistrust and distrust. I would like to say it politely, but how trust can emerge in this kind of exchange is because there is money involved, right? So when the government has money, there is trust in rural communities that there's a piece of pie for us. So, and then when the place-based social enterprise could turn the money into what I call monumental projects, museums, B&Bs, restaurants, material, cultural, tangible products of development, the government could, could trust the community or the intermediary part. So because, why? Because first, the government needs to report. I give you $1,000, what did you do with it? And I have to see it, right? So very cognitive kind of trust. And the question is that, how is it that place-based social enterprise could become so successful? It's because what they did is what we're trying to put down into a term is a corporatization of community, meaning that a community has a product, even though every community has the same product. They have, so if you go down in Buren, you'll see a museum every 20 kilometers because every community has their own museum, but it doesn't matter because they have a product to offer. They have the handicrafts, they have the museum, they have the restaurant, even though most restaurants serve fish and chips and they taste all the same because they're using the same recipe, but they have products, right? And then secondly is that who are these people who are actually working behind the social enterprise? It's quite clear cut because A is doing this and his background is this, they all have CVs and it's very transparent. And somehow that is what municipals cannot do until today. So dealing with a clearer entity for the government is creating trust, you know. So if there's something wrong going to happen, I know who's going to sue, I know who's going to call. With communities, only the mayor. So I think that's part of it. And then also at the same time that PPASC is very resilient in a kind that they try to work with different kind of people. So they don't see if you're a person from the town or if you're a construction worker, if you're a bayman, as long as you could work, as long you could create profit, they're going to work with us. So it's basically one-on-one business, kind of a community based business. So it's a business. So that is why government likes it. I give you $1, you're going to make that dollar into $1.20. I give it to community, it's just I'm losing money for $1. You're not making any 20 cents. So that's also one of the aspects.
Thank you. It's a great panel. I just have 3 little comments thinking about how to move forward trust research. First is that trust is not always good, as like you're shown, right? So but we was like, there's an Italian saying trusting is good, not trusting is better. But we still need to think about the utility of trust. So the one thing to do is really think about, when we think about trust, what kind of trust we're talking about has to be very specific about type of trust. The thousands type of trust, right? Talk about social trust, political trust. Even within political trust, we talk about like more diffuse type of trust, trust in the political regime as a whole, or more specific, more critical trust. So it's very important to be specific about the type of trust when we think about the benefits or the is it good or bad to be trusting? So that's the first point. Second point is that immigrants are not always less trusting, right? So we always have this kind of assumption that immigrants coming from low trust country, they have lower trust. But in Canada, for example, socially, like they have higher social trust in general. In Europe, I know lots of research showing that immigrants have lower trust, but in Canada, lots of research showing that one reason is that in Canada, we have lots like point system. The Canadian government trying to select like highly educated, rich people, and oftentimes from rich countries. So then they oftentimes, if not overall, immigrants tend to have higher trust than local Canadians. So it's also very important, like also be more specific about which country of origin, right? Or those like be specific about immigrants group too, and then the hosting context. And then finally is high trust is not always blind trust among racial minorities, right? We cannot say, okay, you're a racial minority, you have high trust in the government and you're blind. I don't think so. In the US, for example, Blacks often have high trust in the government. Over time, if you look at the ANES data, they've been surveying Americans over like almost 100 years, like study 1958. You see the relative gap between, for example, Black Americans and white Americans, their trust gap, political trust gap, often change. And the oftentimes, Black Americans tend to show higher trust in the government than white Americans. So there's also thinking about how to explain that. There's like also need to be more specific about the political trust we talk about. There's different types of political trust. So that's like 3 little points thinking about like how to research about trust, how to move forward trust research.
Okay, so that's our time. Thank you so much for your questions and thank you for the panelists. We will have lunch now, so enjoy.